Good evening. My name's Graham Allison, and it's a great honor for me to welcome back to Harvard and the forum at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Before we turn to the topic of global security and American power tonight, I want to ask you to join me in observing a moment of silence to recognize the victims, families, and friends of last week's terrorist attack on the trains in Madrid. As many of us as Americans saw Europeans express their solidarity with the U.S. after 9/11, let's express our deepest sympathies to the Spanish students who are members of this community and their fellow countrymen at this tragic loss. Well, thank you. Our speaker tonight has many claims to fame and many connections to this university itself. Indeed, he was just commenting to my faculty assistant upstairs that after his period at the White House, his decade at Harvard was among the most, or was he said, the most exciting period of his life. And so we're very glad to welcome him back here. Among the many claims, first I would say, Spig is an exemplar of one of the least noted but greatest strengths of the United States, which is its ability to attract, absorb, and utilize the talents of citizens originally born elsewhere. In this case, a young man named Zbigniew Brzezinski was born in Warsaw, Poland, and became not only an intellectual force in the debate about America's role in the world in an era in which the U.S. emerged as the most important player in world politics, he also rose to the position of National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. Such a phenomenon brings to mind the comment of the famous American philosopher Yogi Berra, who, upon hearing that the first Jew had been elected mayor of Dublin, Ireland, commented, "Only in America." Second, Dr. Brzezinski has been among the most imaginative, most prolific, and most influential authors writing about American foreign policy and international relations over the past half-century. From his 1964 book co-authored with Sam Huntington, Political Power, USA and USSR, through his bestseller, The Grand Failure, The Birth and Death of Communism in the 20th Century, to his most recent publication, a 2004 book just out called The Choice, Global Domination or Global Leadership, he's challenged conventional wisdom and advanced our understanding. As a review of his most recent book puts it, though couched in a sober and nuanced language of policymaking, the book amounts to a point-by-point rebuttal of the Bush Doctrine. Brzezinski criticizes what he casts as the administration's rejection of a binding alliance system in favor of ad hoc coalitions, its advocacy of preemptive war, and its refusal to address terrorism's root causes. I'm sure he'll have something more to say about each of these in his comments. Third, for those of you who don't know Spig from previous visits here, from 1977 to 1981, he served as National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. For that service, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, recognizing his role in the normalization of U.S.-Chinese relations and his contributions to the human rights and national security policies of the United States. Fourth, one of Spig's lesser-known roles, but also interesting for different students here at the school, has been as an entrepreneur par excellence of non-governmental organizations. He was the founding director and actually, with David Rockefeller, the co-inventor of the Trilateral Commission, arguably one of the most influential non-governmental organizations in the world of international affairs, More recently, he's been a significant force on the board of Freedom House, the Polish-American Enterprise Fund, and the American-Ukrainian Advisory Committee. Fifth, as an academic interested in foreign policy, he's always had a kind of a sense and actually instinct for political action and been willing to jump into the arena of politics, serving as chair of the Hubert Humphrey Foreign Policy Task Force in 1968, as principal policy advisor to Jimmy Carter in the 76, principal foreign policy advisor to Jimmy Carter in the 76 presidential campaign, and then just to show that his allegiances go to issues more than parties, as co-chair of the National Security Advisory Task Force for George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988. Spig received his BA from McGill University and then came to Harvard for his PhD. He served as a professor here at Harvard until 1960, when he left us for Columbia. More parochially, here at the school, at the Kennedy School, we count him as a proud parent of a distinguished graduate of the school, his son Ian, who now serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO affairs. So it's thus with great anticipation and pleasure that we welcome back to the forum Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Graham. Members of the Kennedy School community. First of all, I'm very grateful for these kind words. It's always a little awkward to thank anyone for such a generous introduction, because one has to strike a proper balance between appreciation and modesty, and it's not easy to do it. So I'm tempted to emulate what President Carter did not long ago when he was introduced in similarly very generous terms, and he stood up and he said, "Thank you so much for this introduction. Thank you indeed. Of all of the introductions I have ever heard, this one was the most recent." When I was invited to speak here by Graham, I did, of course, prepare my lecture. I taught at Harvard, so I prepared my lecture with a sense of profound responsibility to the Harvard tradition. But then I got a notice from the director of this forum, which says the following: "You will keep your remarks to 25 minutes so that the audience has an opportunity to engage." So I guess this has to be Harvard light, but I'll do my best. I won't concentrate fully on what I had prepared, but I will try to hold it to 25 minutes as instructed. My point of departure is a very obvious statement. The United States today is the only global superpower. That is just a fact, and there isn't really any dispute about it anymore. One may like it, one may not like it, but it's a fact. But because it is a fact, two very important consequences flow from it. The United States, to be effective at this juncture of history as the world's only global superpower, has to be simultaneously the key guarantor of global stability, while at the same time acting as the central promoter of the global common good. If you do just one or the other, you'll fail. Concentration on power alone will produce its antithesis. Concern with the common good alone will ignore the ugly side of human nature, the realities of politics, and you'll fail. You have to combine the two. And that's not easy. But I believe that if the United States succeeds in so doing, it will remain the global superpower for at least 2 decades. Beyond that, I don't think any of us can predict. Unless one of two things happens. Unless there is some sort of a cataclysmic discontinuity in international trends, of a sort that is inherently unpredictable. Some great cataclysm, like a plague or a biological disaster, which we really cannot anticipate. Or alternatively, unless there is a geostrategic catastrophe, which in my view is avoidable, but if it occurs, it will destroy our hegemony. And it could happen if we fail to distinguish between a global obsession, which drives us into a state of fear, with a global strategy. And the two are different. If we confuse global preponderance with omnipotence and act as the latter defined what our power is all about. If we forgot that the contamination of our credibility, which is what has happened in the course of this year and last, detracts from our power. And if the contamination of our credibility and unilateral conduct isolates us, it also detracts from our power. And this is why it's so important that at this stage of history, particularly as we are about to launch into what I hope will be a serious national debate about our role in the world, that we respect two grand lessons of which we ought to be very conscious. That without America and without American power, there can be no effective response to the central geostrategic challenges to global stability and security, but also that to mount an effective response, America needs genuine allies. And the second grand lesson is that a vague, emotional, and semi-theological definition of terrorism as a central global menace is not helpful in defining the challenge that is currently being posed by a massive, unprecedented global political awakening of mankind, nor is it helpful in determining the best way of responding to the global turmoil that this global political awakening is generating. Let me speak briefly to each of these two lessons. The central geostrategic challenges, in my view, are today concentrated in an area which I do define in my most recent book as the new global Balkans. I call it the global Balkans because that area has some of the same manifestations that made the European Balkans the epicenter of instability and conflict in the 19th and parts of 20th century. Massive internal unrest, conflicting pressures and struggles, and a suction effect on big powers. The global Balkans, as I see them today, range geographically roughly from Suez to the borders of Xinjiang, from the southern frontier of Russia to the shores of Pakistan on the Indian Ocean. And within that huge area, we find a variety of peoples, religiously inflamed, ethnically conflicted, densely populated, demographically explosive, massively poor, but rich in energy, which is of vital importance not just to us, but to Europe and the Far East. And we are now heavily engaged in that region as the principal external player. That region encompasses 550 million people, vastly more than Western Europe, in which we became engaged for several decades after 1945. Vastly more, and vastly less familiar to us, vastly more complicated, very unstable, very explosive. I believe we're going to be engaged in this part of the world as the decisive external force for at least a decade, perhaps two. And the very scale and complexity of the problems that we confront could overwhelm us and really seriously damage our ability to lead, to create global stability. To reduce its problems to sort of four key dimensions of a geostrategic type, I would mention the following. The first, Afghanistan and Pakistan and the two are interwoven. And the complexities of Afghanistan are compounded by the dangers that Pakistan involves and poses. And if Pakistan were to explode, the problem would become manifold, more serious. The second issue is posed by Iran, a serious country, perhaps the most serious country in that global Balkans, with a genuine history, an imperial tradition, a seriousness unto itself, and a potential for change, incidentally. And it affects Afghanistan. It also affects the third problem that we confront, which is our involvement in Iraq. 25 million people, we are going to be there for quite some time to come. And that is a massive problem of security, of money, of blood. It is affected by Iran. But it also affects the fourth problem, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the absence of peace and the unwillingness currently of the United States to be seriously engaged on behalf of peace, even though we cannot disengage from Iraq without some serious progress towards peace, because if there isn't, then the next Iraqi government will be simultaneously anti-American and anti-Israeli. To put it in a nutshell, all four of these problems must be in some fashion under resolution if any one of them is to be resolved, because there is an interaction between them. And I think it's quite clear that these problems are not only conflated, but they are beyond our means of resolution. The very scale, the complexity, our inability to be sensitive to many of the regional nuances, our absence of historical perspective, our cultural distance, ultimately our reluctance to undertake the domestic sacrifices in terms of self-denial, as well as blood, that a unitary, unilateral resolution would require. So we need allies. We need allies badly. And the only real ally for us in dealing with this part of the world is Europe, which has been our ally, to whom this region is at least as important to us. It is closer to them. The Europeans have the money and the men and the political capacity to play an important role, provided it is done together. And that's easier said, of course, than done. Getting the Europeans to join us is not easy, especially since there isn't a single European political authority with which you can negotiate. But nonetheless, we still have to try, because without Europe, we will simply not be able to cope. This is why, incidentally, what has been happening the last week is so pertinent and so serious. And some of you may have heard that today, the leader of another country, which has been with us in Iraq, has stated that he will continue to support us. But he nonetheless feels that part of the problem that we now confront is that he was deceived and his country was deceived about the nature of the problem, about the weapons of mass destruction, that there was a misleading position taken by the United States on this subject, and that this contributes to the dilemmas that we now face. I'm speaking of comments made just today by the President of Poland. And that is not without significance, since Poland is the third most important contributor to the military presence in Iraq. We will not get Europe, however, to help us unless there's a shared strategic vision. And particularly unless there is a shared strategic vision regarding the Middle East, which is the problem making processes in NATO, necessarily requiring in turn greater accommodation by the United States to European perspectives, even though Europe obviously has come to accommodate to ours, especially since the relationship of power militarily between Europe and the United States will still continue to favor the United States. On the realm of power, it will be an asymmetrical partnership, but a partnership nonetheless. And we have to support European unity, because an expanding Europe is the core of global stability and has a wider radiating effect that is compatible with our interests, indeed is in our interest. It requires an attitude as well as a commitment and a sense of shared responsibility, and certainly it means that leading cannot be based on misleading. And that's a fundamentally important premise to which I've already alluded earlier, because without credibility and trust, there can be no partnership. And that brings me more broadly to the second dilemma, that one which involves how we define the challenge, how we define the menace, what does it imply for us? I would argue that today, less and less, the central threat is that of a central war, because modern technology increasingly makes a war among the major powers a luxury, which in fact only poorer countries can afford. Major powers have too much to lose simultaneously. But the central challenge is also not terrorism alone, and this is why, in my view, the concept of a war on terrorism with a global reach involves a fundamental misdiagnosis of the actual threat that we're facing and of the underlying challenge that brings it to the surface. To me, the central reality of our time is the intensifying global turmoil, which comes out of the increasing alertness and political awareness of mankind, particularly in the global Balkans, but also more generally elsewhere. We're living now with a world in which 4 billion people are acutely aware of their deprivation vis-à-vis the much wealthier 1 billion. They're restless, they're envious, they don't have a single focus. There's no unifying doctrine today at this stage yet, and I'll come back to that, but there is a sense of unease and growing hostility towards us. And in that context, terrorism is a symptom of this pervasive but intensifying global unrest. It is an ugly manifestation, and there's no excuse for it, but it stems from a complex global reality which has to be addressed in a larger perspective, and not simply by focusing on one specific manifestation of it, namely terrorism. This awakening is the product of many forces. Obviously, the spread of literacy, the availability of television, the expanding reach of internet has a lot to do with it, but it's also very much abetted by globalization. Globalization generated by America, abetted by America, and even propounded by America. And that creates enormous expectations and a great deal of restlessness of a kind which has never previously existed in the history of mankind. And we, in that context, are in many respects the principal instrument of political change and cultural seduction. We generate expectations which cannot be met in the context of the imperative on global stability, which is a legitimate quest, but which nonetheless collides with the consequences of this phenomenon. And I am concerned that if we're not careful, we may find before too long the emergence, in fact, of a unifying doctrine around the world, which will replace or fill the vacuum created by the collapse of Marxism, but which will have an anti-globalist, anti-American dogmatic thrust, namely the notion that America as the vehicle of globalization is the principal instrument of global injustice and global coercion, and that the phenomenon of Americanization and globalization are interrelated. You see the makings of that doctrine in some parts of the world, on the most primitive level in the anti-globalization movements, but on a much more sophisticated level in the writings of a number of political philosophers, particularly in France, but some other places in the world, all the way over to China. And in that setting, then, the existence of a unifying doctrine plus the vibrations and instabilities of the global condition, could in fact make terror much more dangerous, much more pervasive, and much more focused on the United States. And if it were to be wedded at some point to weapons of mass destruction, it could be indeed fatal. Therefore, in this context, we have no choice but to recognize that national insecurity is henceforth the norm for our existence. We have been traditionally secure, and we have viewed national security as something to which we're entitled. That is now finished. National insecurity is a central reality. And coping with it means not only the recognition of the reality of interdependence in insecurity, but of the necessity of institutionalizing cooperation in order to respond effectively to it. And that raises the question whether our policies currently are responsive to that set of conditions. I read the other day, just yesterday I believe, in the New York Times, an article which I thought was rather interesting on terrorism, written by some American-European scholar. And he argues that the war in Iraq has energized so many disparate groups that global terrorism is better prepared than ever to carry on without bin Laden. And he says that there is more and more evidence of global recruitment for anti-American jihad among decentralized small groups around the world that are being linked increasingly by a shared common perspective of hatred. This is why stable alliances based on conviction as well as convenience are so essential. And we cannot cope with this wider challenge if we insist on defining it in theological terms, if we keep talking about an abstract evil, or if we even make such nonsensical statements as have been made at the highest level that, quote, we love things, they hate things, whatever that means. The fact is that terrorism has to be understood both in its global complexity and national or regional specificity. And the question that we have to ask at every instance is, who are the terrorists? Where do they come from? Once we know who they are and where they come from, and in our case it's clear they come from the Middle East and it's connected with the specific Middle Eastern problems, then we begin to know how not only to extirpate them, which we must, but how to prevent the recrudescence, how to undercut the ability for political recruitment. We cannot cope with these problems, if we preach an essentially Manichaean version of global relationships. You're all familiar with the phrase, if you're not with us, you're against us. You all know who has been uttering that phrase so often in the course of the last year and a half. Though I suspect he doesn't know where it originates. It was Lenin who originated it in order to justify the repression of the Mensheviks. You cannot deal with the global problems without enduring friends within enduring frameworks. Ad hoc coalitions are an expression of expediency and often manipulation. You need enduring relationships. We cannot cope in this context if we approach these issues to some extent as if we were blind. The fact is that one of the reasons for the loss of our credibility around the world and the growing isolation is that we have demonstrated in recent times that we're basically blind about some of the issues that we confront. That is the ultimate message of the calamity, the colossal calamity involved in the WMD issue. It has demonstrated to the world that the United States apparently doesn't know what is going on in essentially permeable, primitive countries which were not subject to effective, hermetic, totalitarian control the way the Soviet Union was for many years. What is particularly baffling is that with this being the case, we're still told at the highest level that one has confidence in the leadership of our intelligence community, and that no changes are needed. And one has to wonder whether perhaps there isn't some complicit arrangement here. I will not fire you if you don't tell everyone else that you weren't so categorical in telling me that they have something and that there were some reservations, in fact. In any case, whatever may be going on, the fact is we have had a serious intelligence failure. And if we're going to be dealing with these complex but elusive global issues, we have to have much better human intelligence than we have, much better understanding of different regions of the world, of the historical and cultural propensities that surface even through such extreme forms as terrorism. And a significant reform of the American intelligence community, and particularly greater emphasis on political intelligence, is very badly needed. We cannot cope if we do not infuse globalization with much more meaningful humane content. This is absolutely critical, because one of the elements of globalization is the sense of the loss of empowerment in the weaker economies and the poorer countries, and the sense that key decisions are moving far away into private, distant hands. This is a reality not easy to adjust, but it's quite essential if we are, in fact, to promote more and more international cooperative arrangements designed to create greater freedom for trade, eventually perhaps movement for people. But that means a redefinition of what we mean by globalization, and also a willingness to abide by its rules when it doesn't serve our interests. We do that primarily when challenged by co-equal. And the time when we live up to the rules most scrupulously is when we're challenged by the EU. And that's not an accident. We cannot cope with these dilemmas if our foreign policy is made largely on the basis of rather extremist perspectives, panic-mongering, and simple labels. And certainly we'll not be able to cope with it if we slide into a self-fulfilling hostility with a huge religion that is one of the key religions of mankind. And yet, there has been a tendency in that direction lately, and it stands in sharp conflict with the 40 years of foreign policy making in the United States, which was so successful and made us the only global superpower, but was based on moderation and bipartisanship. That was the key to American success from president to president. People changed. Parties in power changed. But the basic lines of American strategic engagement were formulated on the basis of principles derived from a moderate consensus within the United States. I hope that in the course of this debate, we'll move in that direction. It won't be easy. And certainly I hope the next president does something very direct to institutionalize such bipartisanship in foreign policy. I have been as bold as to suggest recently in Washington even what the two alternatives for the presidency ought to do in terms of the appointment of Secretary of State, to illustrate the point, but to illustrate it perhaps with a serious suggestion. I think Senator Kerry, if he were to win, could not do much better than if you were to appoint the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Lugar, as his Secretary of State. And if President Bush were reelected, he could certainly pick a leading Democratic senator, for example, Lieberman, who supported him on the war, to be Secretary of State, or someone like him. Biden may be more difficult for him to accept. The point is, we need to return to a centrist foreign policy if we are to deal with the geostrategic dilemmas and with the new phenomena on the global scene, which I have tried to present in a shorthand fashion. If we don't do that, I do not believe we'll be able to maintain our global leadership for too long, because the isolation of the United States, the loss of credibility of the United States, will produce countervailing forces which will not replace us as the new source of stability, which will not create a new global superpower, but will push us collectively into growing and an increasingly significant global chaos. And that is, to me, the central threat that would arise out of the failure of the United States to exercise effective leadership. Let me end my comments, so there's time for discussion, by reading to you an excerpt from a letter that I received just very recently. It's from a European whose English, as you can see from what I'll read, is not his native tongue. He's an elderly person, as he tells me in the beginning of the letter. And when I started reading the letter, I was a little suspicious because it is extremely complimentary to me. So I thought that obviously some request will shortly follow. The compliments were very endearing. I am vain enough even to read them to you. I was praised for my wisdom and experience, for being an American patriot, a man of conscience, a great strategist, architect of American power. So I was now ready for some request. But then he went on to say the following, and I'm now reading. You will surely agree with me that, as history teaches, the great powers usually collapsed not because of their weakness, but paradoxically because of their strength. Strength makes for arrogance. Arrogance makes for blindness. And blindness does not permit one to see all real, potential, or even hypothetical dangers, menaces, perils, risks, and threats. It does not permit one to see and identify them early enough, clearly enough, and correctly enough. The great powers collapsed when they had reached the peak of their strength, when they were at the peak of their economic, political, or military abilities, capabilities, or possibilities. They always collapsed when their actions, endeavors, and undertakings were not harmonized or synchronized with the quality of their time. Not only does America need America, the world needs America. The world truly does need America to be strong and powerful, although not necessarily warlike and belligerent. Thank you.
So, we're going to get a chance to ask a few questions here. Let me tell you the ground rules. There are microphones on the ground floor, left and right, and also here in the balcony. Please get in line, introduce yourself. You can be as disagreeable as you want, but in a pleasant fashion, as long as you ask a short question. No speeches. And we'll start here with Chuck. Yeah?
Chuck Cogan, Kennedy School. That was a great speech, sir. Do you have a vision of a roadmap, to use that overworked term, of what can happen after the 30th of June in Iraq, or what should happen? I understand from my dwindling contacts in Washington that there is a deep pessimism over what's going to take place after June 30th.
Well, I share some of the concerns, but I think what has to happen is not only an accelerated transfer of sovereignty to the Iraqis under some form of a UN umbrella which permits the perpetuation of American and other troops in Iraq, but at the same time, there has to be some progressive stabilization of the American or European-American relationship with Iran, because Iran has an enormous influence on what will be happening in Iraq, and there has to be some progress on the Israeli-Palestinian peace, because there is no American disengagement from Iraq if there is no peace. And if there is no peace and there is no American disengagement, then the central reality in the Middle East to the people in the region will be American occupation in Iraq and Israeli occupation in Palestine. And the two combined will focus hatred, resentment, terrorism increasingly on us. So we have to view this problem in a wider perspective, and I simply cannot understand why we're doing what we're doing regarding these issues, or in fact not doing what we should be doing regarding these issues, because at stake is not only our well-being, but ultimately even the future of Israel. If the United States begins to be increasingly incapable of dealing with global problems and weakens as the only superpower, the future of Israel is sealed in a negative sense. So it is in the interest of those who attach a great deal of importance to the well-being of Israel that the United States promote that peace. And there are a lot of people in Israel and in Palestine, the majorities, who really want peace. And the Geneva Accords are a definition of what could be a peace. And if the roadmap and the Geneva Accords were wedded together, there would be a perspective that the entire international community would support, and a lot of Israelis and a lot of Palestinians as well. So we have to look at this problem as a complex of issues, and not merely, what do we do to get out? We'll have to be in Iraq for quite some time, but our ability to be present without paying such a price in life and without being the key object of hatred is progress on several political issues at the same time.
Let me get you to push just one step further on that, because this is a local debate here. If we're just trying to take what's realistic between now and the end of the year, so you get to July 1st, you get a handover, the likelihood, I think, that the administration does anything significant on Iran and on Israel-Palestine is pretty slim. So if those two hands should remain the same, what's your picture of the end of the year?
Very much like it is today. More bombs, more casualties, more Iraqis dying, more Americans dying, more Israelis dying, more Palestinians dying. And I suppose that will be defined as progress.
Please, here in the left loge, yes.
Hi, my name is Ryan Cunningham, and I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I want to thank you very much for coming. I thought your remarks were very, very interesting, and I hope very important. My question regards the awakening, the political reawakening or awakening of the billions of people around the world that you discussed, and it seems to me that your proposals or your suggestions are designed to prevent that awakening from becoming violent, but I wonder whether you're suggesting that we use a change in our policies, our foreign policies, and our globalization policies to try to channel that political awakening into the creation of new systems, new governments that look a lot like ours and that agree generally with the policies that we've pursued and that fit nicely into our model of globalization, or whether you see a less, is this too loud, a less belligerent policy, a less unilateralist policy for the United States as contributing to the development of a future for the world. In other words, a future where globalizing capitalism, liberal democracy in the American style, or however you want to define the majority current system is the model, but instead a system that is as different from ours as, say, the current system is from the global system that existed before the First World War. And to the extent that that is your purpose, if it is, how do you see that future organization of states and economics looking in a rough outline?
Well, first of all, nothing's going to happen like a sudden photographic snapshot. Political realities, for better or for worse, change progressively. So we'll either have a gradual deterioration of the global condition, or we'll have a gradual amelioration. If it is the latter, then it has to be based, in my view, on the acceptance of the reality of the global mosaic and of the necessity of a diversity of systems in which certain common universal principles may become to be more recognized, such as respect for the human being, respect for gender differences, equality in a broadly defined sense of opportunity, but certainly no uniformity in political institutions and no patronizing imposition of a single model on others. I was recently engaged in some public as well as private discussion regarding the so-called democracy initiative, which I thought was devised in as patronizing and counterproductive fashion as possible. It was unveiled on an occasion in Washington, which brought together the most enthusiastic supporters of the war in Iraq, not known for their particular friendship towards the Arabs. It was unveiled as an American concept on how to democratize the Islamic world, and everyone was informed that this American plan is going to be presented to the parties concerned on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, but you better take it or else, and that we will present it to our European allies, so presumably they can support us in this venture. And my position was they were serious about it. We have to engage the people in the Middle East in it. We have to recognize that democracy is only possible, one, if it is nurtured gradually, and secondly, if it is nurtured in a setting of political dignity. And that we have to have the Europeans also contribute their views, their concepts, engage in a direct dialogue with the parties concerned. I think only that way can we begin to create something that I call loosely a community of shared interests in the world. That will be a far cry from a world government insofar as the next 20 years are concerned. That's not in the cards even. But certainly a pattern of greater, more institutionalized international cooperation with America and Europe as its hard core, I think is a feasible program, and one which will ensure our values and protect our security. I think a unilateral missionary zeal based, in my view, on extremely simplistic and exaggerated sloganeering is a prescription for American isolation with all of the attendant results thereof.
Thank you.
Here on the right balcony.
Kinger Malik, Boston University, MBA student. Dr. Brzezinski, enjoyed your remarks. I met George Soros a few months ago, and I think he would have enjoyed, I think he shares a lot of your views too. You had briefly remarked that there's a difference we place on human lives on two sides of a conflict. You talked about the Middle East. And, in public pronouncements, the White House, condemns violence by one side and is deeply concerned when the other side does the same thing. Do you see that in a broader sense too? For example, over 5 years, I believe it was about 3 million Congolese that were butchered. But, you compare the global reaction to that to September 11th, where 3,000 Americans were killed, and the global reaction to that. I mean, what do you think, how does the world perceive that? And does that breed enough resentment, and what can we do about that?
Well, we have to be careful not to conflate things which are not the same. There's a difference between, let's say, casualties generated by direct American actions, let's say callous indifference to civilian life, and casualties not inflicted by Americans, but inflicted under an American umbrella, political umbrella, with American weapons, purchased with American money. And thirdly, casualties inflicted by others on others, in which Americans are not participating directly or indirectly. I think the level of American responsibility for the casualties in the Congo is much lower than American participation for casualties inflicted in the mutual killings between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that is still not the same as when we, for example, engage in any indiscriminate killings. By and large, with respect to that, I think the American record on the whole is pretty good. Our military are very disciplined. They don't engage, by and large, in large-scale atrocities, and certainly that is not a subject of policy. But at the same time, one cannot be indifferent to the fact that both in Afghanistan and Iraq, quite a few civilian casualties have occurred, and we have to be very sensitive, not only to the political consequences of that, but to the moral dimensions of that. But having said that, I want to repeat, by and large, the American record in that respect is better than of many other countries whose organized military formations are engaged in various forms of combat.
Who's here on the right floor?
My name is Kahlil Wolf. I'm a student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Thank you very much for your remarks. Would you please elaborate on what you see as the lessons we have learned during the Iran hostage crisis, specifically in United States government, legislation, military, and the intelligence community, that we have applied in today's war on terrorists?
Well, I'm not sure we have learned any particular lessons from the hostage crisis that we're applying today in regards to terrorism. I think the phenomena are quite different, and the nature of the power used is very different. The options available to the United States in the current international context are far greater than was the case when the Cold War was still acute.
Going here to the left.
Hi, my name is May Habib. I'm a student at the college. It can be argued that American and European agriculture protection policies are creating hardship and exacerbating poverty in the developing world, and you say that that's the poverty that leads to terrorism. What do you think will have to happen, or what will it take for America and Europe to abandon these harmful policies?
Well, first of all, I wasn't speaking specifically about agricultural subsidies. That's an inference that you drew. I'm not sure it necessarily follows from what I was saying. Maybe an element nonetheless in the reality that naturally we are much more sensitive to our own domestic interests, and our own domestic interests tend to dictate our policies. And when certain constituencies are influential, that is reflected in the stand that we take. And given our overwhelming power in the world, that produces disproportionate consequences for others. That's one of those dilemmas that we have to work out in the course of the next decade or so. But we should have no illusion that there will be an instant, sudden abandonment, even under the best of goodwill, of American policy's responsiveness to domestic pressures, given the nature of any democratic society. It has to recognize domestic interest as a reality and then try to moderate them over time.
The left balcony.
Dr. Brzezinski, my name is Roham Alvandi. I'm a graduate student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a research associate at the MIT Iranian Studies Group. My question to you is that following the recent parliamentary elections in Iran and the comment and analysis that the reform movement is now dead and that what we will see is a revolutionary movement, not a reform movement, how would you advise the U.S. government, the new U.S. government, which will follow the elections here, to proceed with Iran? Should they pursue a policy of ratcheting up pressure in the hope that the government will collapse, or should they try to enlist Iran as an ally in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that the reform movement is dead. The reform movement didn't prevail in the elections, which themselves were subject to coercion and manipulation. So I don't think that is necessarily evidence for the proposition that the reform movement is dead. For example, in Central Europe, after the imposition of martial law in Poland, the Solidarity movement was proclaimed to be dead. I had senior officials of the Polish government visit me in my offices in Washington and tell me, forget about Solidarity, it's dead. 10 years later, these same officials were asking for assistance in avoiding being tried for crimes committed during martial law because Solidarity had come to power. I think the reform movement in Iran is not dead. I think the orthodox, dogmatic theocracy, in fact, is in its Thermidorian phase. It is retrenching because it is failing. It is losing support. The young generation, which now represents a majority in Iran, is basically alienated. The women are more active, and traditionally women have been important in Iran. This is not like Arab countries. And look at the reception the Nobel winner of the prize in literature received when she returned to Tehran. A massive public demonstration, hardly evidence of a reform movement that is dead. I think the theocracy is beginning to lose social support, and therefore at some point in some fashion it will disappear from the scene. What could revitalize it, in my view, would be the embrace by the United States of a simplistic policy of regime change based on another simplistic slogan, axis of evil, thereby attempting to create a new situation in Iran. I think there were people who entertained the hope that a quick victory in Iraq, greeted by massive enthusiasm because it was liberation and followed by instant political stability, will create a platform for a continued American mission, for another regime change. And I think the fact that this has become more complex than we anticipated has eliminated that alternative. Given the fact that this alternative is no longer extant, the real options are either a kind of rigid antagonism that doesn't produce anything and probably fortifies the increasingly insecure theocrats in power, or a policy of gradual engagement which in fact strengthens the forces for change. We did that quite successfully actually with the Soviet bloc. We engaged peacefully in order to disengage the people in power from power. And it worked. And I think over time, that issue can also be effectively, that goal can be effectively pursued in Iran. Last but not least, we also have to respect the fact that Iran is a serious country. This is probably the most serious country, as I said earlier, in that global Balkans. And we have to be respectful of its aspirations, its definition of its regional role, its security concerns. After all, even on the nuclear issue, where we're fully justified in pressing that they fulfill their obligations to NPT, we still cannot ignore the fact that we have acquiesced to Pakistan next door having the bomb, and also India. Russia, just above, has the bomb. Israel, almost next door, has the bomb, so that the Iranians have at least a legitimate case to make that they have a security problem. And if we want that problem to be addressed effectively, we also have to think of it in a somewhat regional perspective. So that's just the way I would sort of generally structure my position on Iran without entertaining at the same time any simplistic expectations of a dramatic change in the near future. But I think the trend line, on the whole, in my view, is in a positive direction.
Thank you.
My name is Alexander Rossolimo. I'm president of the Center for Security and Social Progress, a think tank. Dr. Brzezinski, you stated that we need to infuse globalization with more humane content. But globalization is driven largely by multinationals, national corporations for whom globalization outsourcing, for example, is a means to greater competitiveness. The annual revenues of some of these corporations, like Walmart, is greater than the GNPs of many countries. So my question is, how do you motivate these multinationals to be more humane?
You can only do it very marginally and step by step. I don't think one can expect to change the nature of the American system dramatically. I don't think one can expect these corporations also to depart from the underlying motive forces that drive them, which is the profit motive and competitiveness. But nonetheless, in a variety of ways, including the WTO, one can strive to have arrangements that take into account the most immediate, desperate needs of others, which create a greater sense of local empowerment, which respond to particular problems, such as, for example, the question of the price of pharmaceuticals for poor countries, which is something that's being, to some extent, promoted, and in which the United Nations can also play a more active role. So I don't offer instant utopian panaceas, but I think if one has the attitude of responsibility towards the state of the global community and is aware of the problems that others face and wants to anticipate the kind of unifying hostility that can emerge, one can make gradual piecemeal accommodations on a variety of issues and perhaps some gradual progress in the positive direction, but without any notion that all of a sudden human nature will change or our own economic system will change dramatically.
Firas Ahmed, I'm a student at the Kennedy School. Hello, Dr. Brzezinski, thank you for your comments. I just wanted to get your comments on a certain issue. Donald Rumsfeld stated a couple months ago that one of the major problems adding to the problem of terrorism were madrasas in Pakistan. And he said that that's another issue that they have to get under control. And I worked on education reform in Pakistan for several months after 9/11, and I know for a fact the only reason those children are in those schools is because the parents can't afford to send them to private schools. And I want to know your thoughts on the role of socioeconomic development, as well as the role of a more historical or socioeconomic approach to addressing or engaging these countries, as opposed to a political one, in that sense. And also, I also wanted to know your thoughts on the role of this administration, as well as the media, and how it has played to create a theological conflict as opposed to a more an issue of socioeconomic development that really, I think, is a source of some of these problems.
Well, let me try to address the last part of what you have raised, because otherwise I would have to speak at considerable length, and to some extent I try to cover part of what you asked. In any case, in my early answer, I think on the theological conflict, it is absolutely critically essential that we do not identify the terrorism we face as Islamic terrorism or even as fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. We don't do that in other cases. We have, for example, terrorism in Northern Ireland. We don't speak of it as Christian terrorism, or even more specifically as Catholic terrorism. We don't speak of it as fundamentalist Catholic terrorism. These religious labels are extremely dangerous because they contribute to contagion. They can spread and then can be translated into manifold hostility towards us. I think it's absolutely essential to concentrate on the specific regional or even national historical aspects of the terrorism that one confronts. Whether it's Ulster, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's Palestine, whether it's the United States. And then in that context, we can face the fact that some of the momentum for terrorism originates also from religious motivation, particularly the notion that one is redeemed in heaven if one sacrifices one's life, even while committing a horrific terrorist act. That has obviously some religious undertones. But we have to avoid stamping that conflict as a religious conflict, because if we do, we'll create a religious gulf in the world, the sharp edge of which will turn against us. So this is absolutely central to the whole problem of dealing, for example, with Pakistan, where the Muslim identity is important, and where increasingly we are being viewed as engaged in some sort of a crusade against the Muslims. I do not know whether the statements attributed to the perpetrators of that colossal outrage in Spain were accurate, but it was striking that they referred to the Crusades as the motivating excuse for that crime. Well, this is precisely what has to be avoided in our response to problems in a country like Pakistan, which is quite volatile, in which the madrasas are teaching a lot of people with intense hatred for us, and who are just looking for excuses to translate the conflict into a religious conflict.
This will have to be the last question here on the left. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Brzezinski. I'd just like to hear your comments on the developments in Libya. Why you think, whether you believe Gaddafi's new initiatives, and if you think that that guarantees him a place at the table. And secondly, why do you think...
Your question is what?
Gaddafi?
Yeah?
About Libya and Gaddafi.
Yeah,
Libya
but
and Gaddafi.
Will he now get a place at the table?
Oh, I see.
And secondly, why you think President Bush is reluctant to collect the weapons of mass destruction in North Korea, about which the president has spoken over and over, namely eloquently that he has weapons of mass destruction? Why do you think that, why has America not taken his threat, so to say, sufficiently seriously?
Well, on the first question, in a sense, Gaddafi is beginning to be admitted to a seat at the table, in a sense, in a broad allegorical sense, in that the exclusion of Libya from the international community is in progress, is beginning to take place. I don't think it's going to go very far in terms of any excessive fraternization with Gaddafi and his regime, but certainly the ostracism of Libya is being finished as a consequence of the admission of guilt that Libya had to undertake, in effect, an act of public penitence and then material penitence for what they did. With respect to North Korea and its weapons of mass destruction, I'm tempted to say, but this is just a flippant answer, and I'll be more serious, that maybe the reason we're acting the way we are towards North Korea is that we know that they have weapons of mass destruction. But I don't mean it too seriously, because I think actually the attitude towards weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was more complex than the question of simple lies. I think it was also a question of kind of collective, mutual reinforcing self-delusion, which created a propensity towards the kind of statements that were made and the gap from truth that resulted therefrom. In the case of North Korea, the problem, however, is due to the fact, and our conduct is due to the fact, that North Korea does not lend itself to a solitary unilateral solution without a really massive military problem and perhaps a very serious political problem. We could do that in the case of Iraq. In my view, that wasn't sufficient justification for doing it, but we could do it, and in fact, we did it quite easily. 3 American divisions were necessary to overthrow a regime and to destroy a government that was said to possess the most destructive weapons that mankind has ever devised, and was said to be capable of unleashing a mushroom cloud over the United States, and that had unmanned vehicles that might disseminate biological agents over the United States. Just 3 weeks, and about 140 dead, which tells you something about the realities of power in that situation. In the case of North Korea, if we were to use force unilaterally, which I think was the thrust of your question, we would probably have immediately a war on the Korean Peninsula. And that could be quite messy. I don't think the North Koreans were enthusiastic about that prospect. If the North Koreans have weapons, have already nuclear weapons, which we're not sure of, but there is a body of opinion, in fact, associated with this school. I asked Perry what he thought. He told me he thought they were probably have about 7 weapons. If they in fact have, let's say, 7 weapons, then they have more than they need for deterrence. For deterrence, they need just 1, even untested. Because if they have 1, but untested, we are not sure if it will work. They may not be sure if it works. But as long as we're not sure if it works, it escalates the threshold in the event that it does work. So 1 is enough for deterrence. If you have as many as 7, you have enough to undertake a military operation of an offensive character. You may have even 2 or 3 that you can sell to others. So that makes it much more difficult. Beyond that, if there's conflict in the area, it could have immediate impact on Japan. Japan is a proto-nuclear power. It could become a nuclear power very quickly, if insecure. And of course, last but not least, and most important of all, there's the question of the Chinese and how they would behave and what they would do in that context. So simply the problem is just vastly different from the issue of Iran. But the lesson that is drawn is the one that should have been drawn in the case of Iran, namely regional cooperation. And that's what we're doing in the case of North Korea. We're seeking essentially, on a regional basis, a solution, the ramifications of which are yet to be worked out, but which essentially involve a quid pro quo. The North Koreans desist and submit to inspections in return for serious economic benefits and some assurances from us of non-offensive military action. And what is being worked out on a regional basis also involves, but we're not there yet, a commitment from the regional countries, including China, that if the North Koreans don't buy such a bargain, that all of the regional participants will be prepared to ostracize North Korea in a fashion that really pinches very hard, namely a watertight, literally a watertight embargo. And if we can fashion that, we may be able to deal with this problem without a war. And if it's still not possible, then there is a greater chance that perhaps there would be some collective endorsement for some action of some sort if necessary. In any case, that's the way we're going about it in the case of North Korea, unlike Iraq, and it shows common sense. And it shows that such approaches are meaningful, they could have worked elsewhere, and there's a lesson in this for the future.
I think when that So we thank Spig for coming, and we hope he'll come back soon. So thank you very much. On Tuesday night, there's going to be a discussion of genocide in Rwanda for the question up on the up from the Lodge, and that's at 6 o'clock on Tuesday.